Hello noble ones and welcome to Metatron's Academy. Today we have a little bit of a response to a channel that I've looked into several times on this platform, and it's a channel that usually puts forth content that I find very useful myself. This is of course not an attack on the channel nor the creator, but it's hopefully an opportunity for linguistic discussion and cultural exchange. So the channel in question is the channel ILoveLanguages, which at the time of this recording has 214,000 subscribers, and as you probably know if you're familiar with the content, they often have a sort of comparative key in their videos whereby they will have the same either bunch of numbers or texts that are read in two languages so you can compare them, and they usually do a great job. But for today they are we're looking at the video where they're comparing classical Latin and ancient Greek. Now, on the ancient Greek part, I'm not really gonna say anything because I don't feel I'm qualified enough to do so. I see some people in the comments complaining about it and how it was rendered, but rather than focusing on consonant and vowels, as they mostly are in the comments, I think it would be more interesting to see if the speaker who read ancient Greek in this video actually was able to represent the pitch aspect of ancient Greek, considering the fact that it was a pitched language, properly or not. I can't really speak on that, so if you do know, you're trained, please let me know. But let's focus on how they rendered classical Latin. We're going to start with the numbers.
Classical Latin, Ancient Greek.
Unus,
Heis,
duo,
duo,
tres,
tres,
quatuor,
tessares,
quinque,
pente,
sex,
hex,
septe,
hepta,
octo,
octo,
nove,
ennea.
dece.
Okay, so the first thing I like to say about the numbers, they're generally okay, but I'm already noticing a sort of pattern that it's very common when it comes to how classical Latin is pronounced. And just to remind you, classical Latin, usually we mean the Latin spoken, usually in urban areas from the 1st century BC to the 2nd century AD, so we're talking about approximately 300 years. And that is a problem that I often see, the fact that, yes, they are showing phonemic vowel length, so some vowels are short, some vowels are long, a very important aspect of classical Latin, but I have a feeling that we are in front of a case of overcompensation, in the sense that this specific speaker, because they really want to make it 100% clear which vowels are short and which vowels are long, they are extending the long vowels too much. I mean, quinque is the way it sounded, very unnatural sounding in my opinion, and then when it comes to very short vowels, where he makes them extremely short. I will defend this in a moment, bringing up some interesting examples in modern, still living languages that are using the phonemic vowel length we are seeing here represented in Latin, and so that I can bring you some ideas of something in context, spoken by someone who is alive and is a native. But before I do that, I'd like to underline one thing. Of course, classical Latin is a reconstructed pronunciation and is not something that we can literally resurrect an ancient Roman and ask them, hey, how did you guys pronounce this? But we do have some solid evidence that I have already mentioned and explained on a dedicated video. You'll find a link in the description, so I won't do it here. But just trust me. If you don't want to trust me, click the link in the description. But do keep in mind that whenever I make a correction, if said correction is based on overwhelming evidence, common sense, and personal experiences with several languages. And this is a sort of a preemptive response to those people in the comments that will tell me it's impossible to know. It's not impossible, the Romans literally told us. But let's continue.
In principio erat verbum, et verb erat apud Deum, et Deus erat verbum. Hoc erat in principio apud Deum.
Okay, so the first problem I'm seeing here, once he's actually reading a full-on paragraph, in this case it's a passage from the Gospel of John, I don't think that's a problem. In fact, I think it's interesting because of something that will happen in a minute. Of course, I've already watched this once. I like being transparent about that. But it's good that they chose the Gospel of John, and you will see why in a second. But the first thing I'm noticing is, I don't know if you noticed this, but the speaker seems to be trying, in order for him to be as authentic as possible, he's putting on a typical Italian accent. And when I say typical, I mean the fake one. Like, this is a very good. No Italian speaks like that. It's an over-exaggeration, of course. And that's what it sounds like. He's kind of putting on that kind of accent, which is absolutely out of place, not only for an Italian, but of course for a classical Latin speaker. So how should he speak? I'll get to that in a second, but overcompensation in extremely long vowels. kind of a weird fake Italian accent in there, a little bit. But the good thing that he's doing is that he is fully nasalizing his M's, which is correct. So you'll notice he doesn't say verbum, but he says verbum, and he only slightly touches the M nasally. That is correct for classical Latin. I'll listen to him continue reading, and then I'll read it myself how I would render it.
Omnia per ipsum facta sunt, et sin ipso factus nihil quod factus.
Did you notice that? Omnia per ipsum facta sunt. It sounds like Super Mario. You will have also noticed that at the end, he doesn't say factum est. He says factust. That's actually okay. I use it myself. It's a shortening version of the fully extended syllabic pronunciation. It's fine, we know it was in common use in Rome, but because this is a religiously connected exposition in this case, just my opinion here, I think it's out of place too. In the sense that if this was representing a conversation casually happening between two ancient Romans, that by all means, shorten all the way. But because this is representing a reading of something sacred, if we want to put it into context, and let's say this was in the 1st century, and instead of the Gospel of John, it was something that had to do with the temple of Apollo, or I don't know, a celebration of or maybe some sort of celebration at the temple of Vesta, what have you, depending on the level of solemnity that the specific reading or public discourse has, I would not do that. So in this case, if we want to be contextualizing it, I wouldn't do that. Still, it's absolutely fine to do it. I think there is only one extra paragraph. We'll listen to it and then I'll read it.
In ipso viterat, et viterat lux hominum, et lux in tenebris lucet, et tenebraeam non comprehenderunt.
Okay, so once again we see extremely long, exaggerated vowels and also a very aspirated H. The H should be aspirated, but it is my opinion that it should be only ever so slightly aspirated, not... That almost sounds Germanic to me. Let me read it to you. I'll read it first in classical Latin, and then for those who prefer, and also find it interesting, I'll read it in ecclesiastical. In principio erat verbum, et verbum erat apud Deum, et Deus erat verbum. Hoc erat in principio apud Deum. Omnia per ipsum facta sunt, et sine ipso factum est nihil quod factum est. In ipso vita erat lux hominum, et lux in tenebris lucet, et tenebrae ea non comprehenderunt. So before I do the ecclesiastical, another thing that I'm adding, that I think he kind of did a little bit, maybe on the numbers, but then he kind of lost it, was the retracted S. So I have spoken about this many times, but if you want to be coherent to the classical period, not ecclesiastical Latin, not medieval Latin, the S, particularly at the end of words, should be a S rather than a S. So, unus, tres. Let's go for ecclesiastical. In principio erat verbum, et verbum erat apud Deum, et Deus erat verbum. Hoc erat in principio apud Deum. Omnia per ipsum facta sunt, et sine ipso factum, et nihil quod factum est. In ipso vita erat lux hominum, et lux in tenebris lucet, et tenebre eam non comprehenderunt. This will be my rendition. Now, let's talk a little bit about the phonemic vowel length and how I believe it should not be exaggerated when expressed, particularly with long vowels. If we look at another language that even today uses phonemic vowel length, then we can look at Japanese. In Japanese, there are several vowels that are distinct or distinguished by their length. For example, o and o, a and a. Let me give you a few words. So desu, so desu. Oba-san, oba-san. Ototo, ototo. Now given, as someone who has lived in Japan for 4 years, and I've heard Japanese spoken in all sorts of contexts, from super formal to super informal, yes, the length is always expressed, but not always at the same level or intensity by natives. So first and foremost, yes, they do say ototo, they don't say ototo, it's exaggerated. Yes, they do say oba-san or oka-san, but they don't say oka-san. Not even Japanese in fully extended situations. For example, they're reading a text and they are being asked to enunciate properly. Even in those situations, they do extend it, they don't overextend it. Similarly though, let's have a look at the expression "so desu." Personally, in my experience, I've heard Japanese fully extended, so say, "so desu ne." But I've also heard Japanese say it like this, "so desu ne." Now, given the latter is almost imperceptible when it comes to the difference between a long and a short for a non-native. For a native speaker who is brought up and grew up knowing the difference between long and short vowels, a minute difference will suffice. And it is my experience, now I'm going to sort of introduce a little bit of a pet theory of mine, but it is my experience that when it comes to language and the natural evolution of language, so the way they're actually spoken, it is a common principle within all human languages to try and reach the highest amount possible when it comes to communication with the least amount possible of energy or resources. Because our human bodies are, in my opinion, hardwired to try and maximize result with minimum effort needed. Why? Because the energy we spend in these sort of things that we use on a daily basis, including language, linguistic communication in combination with body language, all of that energy comes from food. Do we know how much food we have access on a daily basis? As a species, no. So it makes sense from a linguistic standpoint that if you don't need to exaggerate that difference for natives to pick it up, you won't do it. Unless you are in a situation where it makes sense to do it. For instance, emphasis. If a Latin speaker, going back to Latin, wish to put emphasis on the word vita, then sure, they will do it, even extending it. So let's say that they are having a kind of an argument, and then they want to say that life is what really matters, then they will say vita, sure. But unless it's a situation like that, I do believe that they will render it as vita. It's longer, but not super long. And the same for numbers, quinque, rather than quinque. Make it longer, but not too much, so that it sounds natural. This is what I think. Of course, feel free. It's a highly debated topic, so feel free to let me know what you think in the comments below. And as always, thank you for joining Metanos Academy.